facial artery, arises in the carotid triangle a little above the lingual artery and, sheltered by the ramus of the mandible, passes obliquely up beneath the digastricus and stylohyoideus, over which it arches to enter a groove on the posterior surface of the submaxillary gland. It then curves upward over the body of the mandible at the antero-inferior angle of the masseter, passes forward and upward across the cheek to the angle of the mouth, then ascends along the side of the nose, and ends at the medial commissure of the eye, under the name of the angular artery. This vessel, both in the neck and on the face, is remarkably tortuous, in the former situation, to accommodate itself to the movements of the pharynx in deglutition, and in the latter, to the movements of the mandible, lips, and cheeks. Relations. In the neck, its origin is superficial, being covered by the integument, platysma, and fascia. It then passes beneath the digastricus and stylohyoideus muscles and part of the submaxillary gland, and frequently beneath the hypoglossal nerve. It lies upon the constrictoris pharyngeus medius and superior, the latter of which separates it, at the summit of its arch, from the lower and back part of the tonsil. On the face, where it passes over the body of the mandible, it is comparatively superficial, lying immediately beneath the platysma. In its course over the face, it is covered by the integument, the fat of the cheek, and, near the angle of the mouth, by the platysma, rhizorius, and zygomaticus. It rests on the buccinator and caninus, and passes either over or under the infraorbital head of the quadratus labii superioris. The anterior facial vein lies lateral to the artery, and takes a more direct course across the face, where it is separated from the artery by a considerable interval. In the neck it lies superficial to the artery. The branches of the facial nerve cross the artery from behind forward. Branches. The branches of the artery may be divided into two sets, those given off in the neck, cervical, and those on the face, facial. Cervical branches. Ascending palatine, tonsillar, glandular, submental, muscular. Facial branches. Inferior labial, superior labial, lateral nasal, angular, muscular. The ascending palatine artery, A. palatina ascendens, arises close to the origin of the external maxillary artery, and passes up between the styloglossus and stylopharyngeus to the side of the pharynx, along which it is continued between the constrictor pharyngeus superior and the pterogordius internus to near the base of the skull. It divides near the levator villi palatini into two branches. One follows the course of this muscle, and, winding over the upper border of the constrictor pharyngeus superior, supplies the soft palate and the palatine glands, anastomosing with its fellow of the opposite side and with the descending palatine branch of the internal maxillary artery. The other pierces the constrictor pharyngeus superior and supplies the palatine tonsil and auditory tube, anastomosing with the tonsillar and ascending pharyngeal arteries. The tonsillar branch, ramus tonsillaris, ascends between the pterogordius internus and styloglossus, and then along the side of the pharynx, perforating the constrictor pharyngeus superior to ramify in the substance of the palatine tonsil and root of the tongue. The glandular branches, rami glandulari submaxillary branches, consist of 3 or 4 large vessels, which supply the submaxillary gland, some being prolonged to the neighboring muscles, lymph glands, and integument. The submental artery, A. submentalis, the largest of the cervical branches, is given off from the facial artery just as that vessel quits the submaxillary gland. It runs forward upon the mylohyoideus, just below the body of the mandible, and beneath the digastricus. It supplies the surrounding muscles, and anastomoses with the sublingual artery and with the mylohyoid branch of the inferior alveolar. At the symphysis menti it turns upward over the border of the mandible and divides into a superficial and a deep branch. The superficial branch passes between the integument and quadratus labii inferioris, and anastomoses with the inferior labial artery. The deep branch runs between the muscle and the bone, supplies the lip, and anastomoses with the inferior labial and mental arteries. The inferior labial artery, A labialis inferior, inferior coronary artery, arises near the angle of the mouth. It passes upward and forward beneath the triangularis and, penetrating the orbicularis oris, runs in a tortuous course along the edge of the lower lip between this muscle and the mucous membrane. It supplies the labial glands, the mucous membrane, and the muscles of the lower lip, and anastomoses with the artery of the opposite side, and with the mental branch of the inferior alveolar artery. The superior labial artery, A labialis superior, superior coronary artery, is larger and more tortuous than the inferior. It follows a similar course along the edge of the upper lip, lying between the mucous membrane and the orbicularis oris, and anastomoses with the artery of the opposite side. It supplies the upper lip and gives off in its course 2 or 3 vessels which ascend to the nose. A septal branch ramifies on the nasal septum as far as the point of the nose, and an alar branch supplies the ala of the nose. The lateral nasal branch is derived from the external maxillary, as that vessel ascends along the side of the nose. It supplies the ala and dorsum of the nose, anastomosing with its fellow, with the septal and alar branches, with the dorsal nasal branch of the ophthalmic, and with the infraorbital branch of the internal maxillary. The angular artery, A angularis, is the terminal part of the external maxillary. It ascends to the medial angle of the orbit, embedded in the fibers of the angular head of the quadratus labii superioris, and accompanied by the angular vein. On the cheek it distributes branches which anastomose with the infraorbital, after supplying the lacrimal sac and orbicularis oculi. It ends by anastomosing with the dorsal nasal branch of the ophthalmic artery. The muscular branches in the neck are distributed to the pterogordius internus and stylohyoideus, and on the face to the masseter and buccinator. The anastomoses of the external maxillary artery are very numerous, not only with the vessel of the opposite side, but in the neck, with the sublingual branch of the lingual, with the ascending pharyngeal, and by its ascending palatine and tonsillar branches with the palatine branch of the internal maxillary. On the face, with the mental branch of the inferior alveolar as it emerges from the mental foramen, with the transverse facial branch of the superficial temporal, with the infraorbital branch of the internal maxillary, and with the dorsal nasal branch of the ophthalmic. Peculiarities. The external maxillary artery not infrequently arises in common with the lingual. It varies in its size and in the extent to which it supplies the face. It occasionally ends at the submental, and not infrequently extends only as high as the angle of the mouth or nose. The deficiency is then compensated for by enlargement of one of the neighboring arteries. 4. The occipital artery, A occipitalis, arises from the posterior part of the external carotid, opposite the external maxillary, near the lower margin of the posterior belly of the digastricus, and ends in the posterior part of the scalp. Course and relations. At its origin, it is covered by the posterior belly of the digastricus and the stylohyoideus, and the hypoglossal nerve winds around it from behind forward. Higher up, it crosses the internal carotid artery, the internal jugular vein, and the vagus and accessory nerves. It next ascends to the interval between the transverse process of the atlas and the mastoid process of the temporal bone, and passes horizontally backward, grooving the surface of the latter bone, being covered by the sternocleidomastoideus, splenius capitis, longissimus capitis, and digastricus, and resting upon the rectus capitis lateralis, the obliquus superior, and semispinalis capitis. It then changes its course and runs vertically